Hello and welcome to the SUSE Security Series brought to you with Futurum Research. My name's Stephen Dickens and I'm joined today by Keith Basil. Hey Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So Keith, let's just tell the listeners and viewers, what do you do for SUSE?
So I am the general manager for the Edge business unit at SUSE. So all things strategic, product marketing, product development for SUSE's Edge business is what I oversee.
Fantastic. So they've got us here today talking about security. Let's dive straight in. We're talking about security from the edge right through compute, on-premise. How are people securing their sensitive data?
Yeah, it's a great question. So being edge focused, there's a new perspective that we have to take when we look at security at the edge, because traditionally companies look holistically at a very small geographical footprint for their hardware, for their compute infrastructure. But with the edge, what's happening due to the scale of edge and the massive locations and deployments under management here, you have to think differently. When it comes to security, we look at breaking away from the old world of segmentation, firewalls, and things like that, and we try to eliminate what we call implicit trust. Like, just because you're on the network doesn't mean we trust you, for example. Now, if you take that philosophy and put it out at the edge, for example, in my world, just because something is at a store in the region 1, for example, doesn't mean that anything that's on that network should be trusted to bring it back to the core services or to the headquarters or to be on the corporate network, for example.
So one of the key questions there that springs to mind for me is, how do people integrate that? We're talking about the scope, everything from the data center,
Sure.
whether that's your data center, whether that's a cloud data center, and they're trying to integrate that all the way to the edge. Tell me a little bit about that integration.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. So if you can imagine just the amount of threat vectors that you can see across a very large geographical footprint and trying to keep that under management. And the biggest philosophical shift is to not think about classic security controls, but think about identifying identities. So classically, you would have humans which have identities, obviously, but now we are giving identities to applications, to network switches, to routers, things like that. And once we have these identities, we can then build policy. To answer your question, once we have that policy framework, we can then have that policy propagate through your entire footprint. And that gives us the leverage and scale we need to address security at the edge, for example, and address the integration piece.
So how does that build into trust? We hear a lot about zero trust.
Correct.
We hear about people looking at trust more generally. How does that framework, and I was really interested in the point you made around identities, how does that build into trust?
It's a required fundamental piece of a zero trust architecture. So zero trust builds on the things that I mentioned earlier, where we do not take on or adopt that implicit trust that we get by having something on the network. Even if it's on the network, or for example, if it's a personal device that you bring to work, we would not trust that device unless we could verify an identity for that particular device. So the identity assignment is key. It's one main principle. Just and the default position of just not trusting anything that's not explicitly called out is the second one. And then having a policy-driven framework for that security enforcement, for the allowances of things to run on the network, is really the fundamental tenets or principles of zero trust. So we're adopting that by default based on what we're doing, but it is the only thing that we've seen from a security perspective, especially with security integration, that checks the boxes from compliance to addressing threats that don't even exist yet.
So obviously at the edge, thousands, tens of thousands of devices, connections, endpoints. One of the big things that I could see as a barrier there is, how do we get and drive visibility across that huge sort of threat vector and all that, so just that sheer volume of devices. So talk to me a little bit about how people are looking and leveraging the SUSE technology from a visibility perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question. A few years ago, we acquired a company called New Vector. I was on the team that was vetting that acquisition, and I was very much in favor of acquiring New Vector because of all the security tools that we saw in the cloud native world. They were the most aligned to a zero trust process. Now, how does that answer your question? So inside the new vector technology, there's a policy enforcement engine that we can push so that any of those smaller devices, those pieces, those parts, those identities that we have at the edge can be enforced from a security policy at the edge. Just like we say in the edge space that applications need to be pushed to where they provide the most business value for the customer. And these typically are at the edge, and the security policy, the security engine, all the tooling and enforcement follows that same philosophy.
So Keith, you're on the road a lot chatting to customers. What are they telling you about digital trust?
Well, for us and the customers, digital trust is about ensuring that their security policies are enforced where they are needed most. And a lot of times we see the zero trust principles providing that digital trust. I'll give you one of our grocery store customers. They have a very large footprint, again, from the edge perspective, and they are very sensitive to the credit card payments that happen from each store location. And so they are really keen on making sure that whatever is explicitly defined to run at that location is the only thing that runs at that location. And so our mission, our joint mission, is to have a policy that ensures that at all times. So what that gives us is that we have now an environment that is tightly defined. And if a rogue process or a rogue actor or rogue threat enters that network or into that infrastructure, it is immediately turned away, canceled, quarantined, what have you. So it has no effect on what is explicitly defined to be running at that location.
So if you were to summarize up the SUSE position as it relates to digital trust into three key takeaways, what would those be?
The three pillars, or the three legs of the stool, if you will, would be our strength in the enterprise Linux business. That comes from over 30 years of hardening Linux, compliance-focused features inside Linux. We have NIST validated encryption modules, for example, baked into Linux. We have a secure supply chain, secure build process for our enterprise Linux. So that's pillar number one. Pillar number two would be the Rancher family of products, mainly the Rancher management product. And then we also have distributions of Kubernetes that enhance security as well. So that would be number two. And then if you look at our New Vector acquisition, it's a security product. Think of New Vector as coming from the top down, and that would be the third leg. So New Vector would be the thing that enforces our zero trust philosophies and approach from a cloud native perspective. So if you can take that, and then you take the enterprise value of Linux and come from the bottom up, you get this kind of golden spike moment where the two come together in a brilliant fashion. And that really provides the three-legged stool value for our customers.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to summarize.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.